Hey everybody, Pastor Kevin here bringing you this week's group curriculum guidance. We are in page 52, the chapter titled Treachery Fulfilled. And I want to give you a special note as well for those of you leaders that are listening to this. The last chapter of this book we are skipping. We had originally thought about doing that on Easter for our Easter message, but we're choosing not to do that. So know that we will get back to that with a new book in probably the next 5 to 6 weeks. So just so you know. All right, let's jump straight in. Question number 1. Have you ever witnessed someone choose not to react in a violent or otherwise heated situation? What happened? Was the choice bad or good from your perspective? This opens up to the content for today, which is you have a situation where Jesus chooses not to respond in violence, but for example, Peter does, even though we don't know it's Peter from this. Someone has a sword and they cut off an ear. And that is, based on one of the other gospel accounts, that is Peter. So you see that it's more of like, hey, have you ever seen this go down in a right way where like violence wasn't used and it turned out? Because maybe you're thinking like, well, yeah, no, they probably should have protected themselves or whatever. Anyway, you can come up with the stories that will work for you. Question number 2. Compare Jesus' demeanor in Matthew 26:38 through 42, which is from last session, and Matthew 26:50 through 64. What seems clear to Jesus at this point? Should we take anything away from these two scenes, or is this simply showing the power and resolve of Jesus? It's clear that there's a level of resolve that has occurred with Jesus. I think Jesus has asked his question. He's made his appeal to the Father, and the Father clearly did not answer in the way of his original appeal, right? And I think that's super powerful for us to recognize. He went to the Father with his biggest concern, the depth of his soul, the pain he was feeling, but he did say, hey, your will be done. And so there is a level of resolve there already, but the point is that it seems like he's gotten past the challenge and anxiety, at least visually through reading Matthew, and he's stepping into the fray knowing the work he has to do. Now, again, we don't have all of the details behind this, but maybe it's good to discuss. If you look at these two scenes, we can just say when Jesus does something in the Bible that, oh, yeah, it's Jesus, he's the Son of God and that type of thing. But I think that's not fair to do. There are probably times when we should do that. Like, no, that is the vocation of God that's doing something, not something that's really within our realm. But a lot of it is not. A lot of it is Jesus is the God-man, right? He is fully God, fully human, and he has a human he has human reactions. He has all kinds of things. So the thought is, like, have this discussion. Well, should we take something from this? What do you think maybe would be useful for us to actually walk away from these passages and say, okay, this might be valuable. I'll give you an example. I think the resolve, Jesus got his answer from the Father, and he pressed on into the work that he knew was going to be challenging and so forth. So there's a faithfulness. There's all kinds of things you could kind of come up with here. So anyway, you can go through that with your group. Question number 3. Read Matthew 21:8 through 11 and compare it to Matthew 26:47. Describe the difference in the crowds. While there's crowds in both situations, one crowd is very positive toward Jesus and clearly the other one is not. You don't even... They're just kind of hired minions for all intents and purposes. We don't know if they got paid. We don't know anything like that. But they have clearly been put into action by the religious elite in the second passage. In the first passage, it seems like people are literally looking forward to something from this one who could be Messiah, who could be king. So just talk about that. Talk about the differences that have happened, because I think we do see that crowds that seem like they're for Jesus, there seems to be other crowds that are not for him, and the question is are some of those the same? Because humanity, we're fickle. We are fickle people, and we can choose sides and change sides rapidly, depending on what's motivating us, and I think that's important to know. Question number 4. Consider the titles that have been used for Jesus in Matthew's gospel so far and the stories in which they were presented. How does Judas greet Jesus in this situation? How does this compare with other titles, and what might be the point? There are several titles that are used for Jesus throughout Matthew. Son of Man is one of them. You hear Son of God. You hear Son of David. So go back and look at those stories. And also look back and when he's called Rabbi, because it seems like Judas is the only one who calls him that, and while others call him Lord. It's pretty powerful to recognize that and see, like, who are the audiences that seem to be using these titles that are more grandiose or bigger or whatever, and who are the audiences that don't, right? So you look at how kind of some of the religious elite may talk to Jesus or give him a title, and how the others do. And I think it's helpful to take a look at that. Question number 5. Read Matthew 16:21 through 22 and 26:35. We know that the disciple in Matthew 26:51 through 53 is Peter by reading John 18:10 through 11. How does this fit with Peter's previous inclinations? Does he understand what Jesus is doing? Go through all of those verses. And you could talk about more stories. There are plenty of stories where you get an image. I'd argue that Peter is one of the most defined characters in the gospel accounts other than Jesus himself. Peter, you get an idea of his kind of how he operates. You see his courage and boldness. You see a lot of things like that. And I think it's important to look at those images and kind of see how this all fits in to what's going on, because I would argue he loves Jesus. He's on Jesus' side for sure, but he still doesn't understand what Jesus has come to do. He understands it in a grand sense, but the way he would think it's going to play out is totally wrong. So it's important to notice that, because we have some of the same inclinations in us. Sometimes we want Jesus to operate in a particular way. We want God to like answer our beck and call, to respond to our whim. And in reality, if you think about the Bible, it talks about God knows the plans he has for us to prosper us. So he says, "For I know the plans I have for you," not our plans for him, right? And I think there is a level of having faith and trust in God, and being faithful into that trust. So living into that, like our faithfulness actually operates out of that trust, knowing that, yeah, maybe what I want isn't what he wants at this situation, which is clearly through this section and the previous. Question number 6. Though one biblical statement is not enough to develop a full ethical stance, what do you think Jesus' words in Matthew 26:52 mean in the context? Do you think they have weight beyond this specific situation with Peter? What does Jesus' further statement in Matthew 26:53 add to the discussion? In Jesus' reprimand to Peter, the one who cut off the ear, right? It's funny how Matthew seems to be protecting Peter somehow. The gospel author, Matthew Levi. And he doesn't say it's Peter, but Peter gets reprimanded by Jesus. Like, hey, look, you aren't getting it. If you're going to wield the sword, he's making this kind of generic statement and then a specific one on, like, don't you think I have the power to call down what's necessary to stop this from happening? And it's kind of it's a question that to me just assumes, yeah, you do have that power. Like, it assumes the answer of course you do, right? Peter's still not getting it. And he's wanting to go to battle to make this happen, to protect. And again, part of the idea behind this, protecting the Messiah, that's like not a horrible inclination. The point is that when the Messiah is God, that he has full view of what needs to happen. He knows the state of affairs in everyone's hearts, and you can't override that, right? That's the point here. So I think we should be careful how we make an actual statement from this one thing, right? It's like whoever bears a sword, right? They'll be destroyed by the sword, that type of thing. While some take a verse like this and they say that this shows you Jesus is a pacifist. And I'm not sure that you can do that. You have to look at the context. The context is basically saying Jesus saying, just like I pray to the Father that his will be done, even though I don't want to do this, the Father says basically, and even though we don't see a response, Father does not respond with, yeah, sure, we're not going to do it that way anymore. He continues down the line of going through the very thing that he knew he had to do, and that includes non-violence, because the point is he's going to absorb all violence on him. He's going to take on all violence. So when the Messiah is going to do the vocation, the job that he had from the beginning of time. Like this was set up forever, right? Eternally in God's mind, that when that is going to happen, then that's why this isn't important here. Does this eliminate the possibility for violence other places? No. But I would also suggest you do have to think about it as like, okay, so when the king is getting his work done, right, when he's being sacrificial and he's saving humanity, he actually chooses the method of nonviolence. So maybe when we are actually saving and so forth, at least, right, when we're evangelizing, maybe the sword doesn't belong in that discussion, right? You see what I'm saying? So you could probably make some smaller conclusions in the middle of this, but I don't think that making the grander conclusion that pacifism is the right thing can be made from just this verse. So anyway, you guys can talk about that and go through it. Question number 7. What scriptures is Jesus speaking of in Matthew 26, 54, and 56? It's actually a bit of a tough one because in the first case, it does not reference anything in particular. I might suggest, the first thing you would do contextually is go back to, well, what's the last kind of scriptural reference that he's had? And if all else fails, maybe it's like, well, maybe he's just saying in the most generic way that this job is what's been pointed to, that God is going to resolve the problem. In the second sense, you do have the fact that the disciples flee. And if you look at the very previous reference to the Old Testament, you'll see the Zechariah reference from last session, and that talks about when you strike the shepherd, the sheep scatter. And that seems to be what's happening here. So I'm not absolutely sure, but I would argue the first one's probably more general to the point of what Scripture is pointing to, a messianic one who has a vocation, and that vocation is misunderstood by humanity. So I think there's that. So you have like suffering servant from Isaiah, and you have the Psalm 2, Son of God, the King that's in the throne. Then you have the Daniel 7, which is actually referenced in here. You have Psalm 110. You have all of these things that are creating this picture of what this messianic king would look like, and what their vocation would be. So I think maybe on the generic side, that's kind of what it's pointing to, and on the other, and again, I'm not being dogmatic about that. The second one seems to be, since the thing that happens right after it is exactly what the last reference pointed to, I think that's fair. Question number 8. Identify the aspects of Jesus' arrest and trial before the Jewish religious leaders, known as the Sanhedrin, that make his conviction suspect. In the sermon, you got a lot of this information. There might be things that were overlooked. There might be things that you thought or you can see as well. Talk about all those things, because the point is, in all of this, is like, this is not a real trial. This is, it's more like a discussion in someone's living room that somehow is carrying a weight that it shouldn't have. So do talk about those different situations. Question number 9. What was Jesus finally accused of? How was the Sanhedrin able to substantiate this verdict? The text says it's what upsets the high priest is blasphemy. They tried to bring false witness against Jesus. And then eventually the line that brings it all together is destroy. Like he said he could destroy the temple and raise it in 3 days. And in reality, that's again, go back, try to find that in Matthew. It's not there. It is in John, however, and it's speaking about his body. If you go to John 2, you'll see that passage there. And John is basically saying, hey, Jesus says, destroy this body, and in 3 days, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I'll bring it back, in essence. So, but it says specifically, John says he was talking about his body. So I suggest Jesus probably did say something like this, and the people are giving witness to it, but I think they've tweaked it and they've misunderstood it, because in reality, Jesus isn't even saying he's going to destroy the temple. He didn't even say I'm able to destroy it. He's saying, and if anything, he's saying you have destroyed the temple, but boy, destroy it and I'll bring it back, right? And he's talking about his body, and I think in a greater sense, he's talking about the overall temple idea, the temple structure, because who is the temple of the living God? Well, Jesus, and his spirit goes into his people, who then become the spirit of the living, become the temple of the living God. And this takes us to the gospel motivation. If you look at the sham of this trial and how he's being treated like a thief, it's like no question that Jesus is actually crucified between two thieves. He's receiving a slave's death. And why? To save a bunch of criminals. So he's receiving a criminal's death to save the criminals. Right? And this is one of those things where this week, think how can I bless the name of my King this week? How can I praise his name? Maybe it's when the next Sunday comes, which just happens to be Easter that's coming. We just bless him. Maybe it's you need to do something like fast for a day this week and just be reminded of the glory of your King and what he has done on your behalf. That he was silent amidst injustice to save a bunch of unjust people, right? You and me, we can't save ourselves. He saves us. He substitutes himself. He is the one who declares victory over everything that's evil, cosmic victory. And he's prepared a place. That's the whole point, is he's pointing us to a new heavens and new earth where we will be with him in his presence. What we gain in all of this is Jesus. Thank God for that. So I hope you have a great meeting this week. I hope your dialogue is good. I pray that God goes with you this week, and I hope to talk to you again in the coming weeks.